Okay, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start the afternoon session. For people who weren't here before, my name is Tom Wetmore. I'm the director of the Center for Jazz Studies. Our next speaker is Kelsey Klotz. Kelsey Klotz is a musicologist specializing in the relationships between jazz and popular music, identity, and power. Her recent book, Dave Brubeck and the Performance of Whiteness, on Oxford University Press 2023, is the first critical book-length study of the role of whiteness in shaping jazz history. She is currently working on a project titled Jazz Patriarchy, which examines the distinct mechanisms and values in place that have prioritized men within jazz. Her talk is entitled Placing Absence, Jazz Patriarchy in Print, 1936 to 1974. Please welcome Kelsey Klotz.
All right. Where are the women in jazz? As a kid in elementary school, all I wanted to do was join the jazz band, just like my older brothers had. My winter weekends were filled with trips to jazz competitions all over Iowa, as my brother's band sought qualification for a spot at the all-important Iowa Jazz Championships. If you know, you know. It didn't matter that the trumpet was a boy's instrument or that the other bands were full up on boys and young men with only a handful of girls and young women to be seen, or that my idols at the time, Wynton Marsalis, Clifford Brown, Dizzy Gillespie, were all men. Our high school band, Indianola's Jazz One, was comparatively flush with women for the 10-year stretch between when my oldest brother joined the band in 1996 and I graduated from it in 2006. When I looked at the trumpet section, I saw a majority of women just as often as I saw a majority of men, so I never had to ask where the women in jazz were. So, where are the women in jazz? Often, jazz and gender is framed around women's absence. Why, for example, aren't there more women and girls in jazz? Where are they? Such questions suggest the feeling that the issue, women's absence, reflects something about women and their disinterest or ability or needs, rather than the spaces and places that have been built in jazz's name over the past century. To counteract this, countless presentations have been made, books and articles written, all on exceptional women in jazz, all defying the notion of women's absence. As Sherry Tucker writes, the phrasing and marketing, quote, woman in jazz, depends on the assumption that jazz does not already have women in it, a frustrating premise for women who play jazz and the people who write about them, end quote. The phrase places women where they already thought they were, in jazz, thus reifying their perpetual absence. If, instead of asking the question, we simply acknowledged that jazz has not been a space for women, non-binary, and trans folk, if we've shifted focus to the places that have been created by jazz communities for jazz players, then our perception of absence and its reasons start to shift as well. In this presentation, I put the focus on patriarchy, analyzing downbeat from its start in 1934 through 1974 to understand why jazz has not been a space for women, non-binary, and trans folks. A look at the magazine's cover images in this period offers a quick way into this story. This chart shows the number of men and women who appeared on Downbeat's cover between 1940 and 1974. Across the early 1940s and through the war years, women and men were represented fairly evenly. In the immediate post-war years, there is an increase in the number of men on the cover. But across the 1950s, women disappeared almost entirely from Downbeat's covers. The decade from 1951 to 1960 represented a stunning 94% decrease in women on the cover of Downbeat. And this trend continued into at least the early 1970s. Full disclosure, the only reason that this presentation stops at 1974 is because that's where I'm at in my research. Of course, Downbeat is only one way of understanding jazz spaces. Musicologist Emma-Louise St. Amand's work with girl magazines like 17 and Confessions and high school yearbooks in the 1950s and 1960s is important evidence of that. In these representational spaces, girls didn't have to perform masculinity to find a place in jazz, and jazz was typically not a site of subversive gender politics for these girls. But these magazines are also not what made it into jazz history. Downbeat became the first draft of jazz history. Patriarchy was embedded throughout Downbeat's pages and as a result framed jazz's historiographical spaces across the United States and potentially around the world. The way jazz magazines like Downbeat prioritize, categorize, discuss, and portray jazz musicians and their sounds in the service of curating and maintaining jazz canons and histories that typically privilege male musicians is a defining feature of jazz patriarchy, and importantly, has been a way jazz patriarchy has been perpetuated for nearly a century. Because of its early and continued influence on jazz listeners, audiences, and musicians, I focus on Downbeat in order to, 1, determine how women were represented in the magazine, 2, dissect the emergence of jazz patriarchy in the jazz industry, and 3, understand how representational spaces like Downbeat defined jazz values. Between 1934 and 1974, 3 distinct eras of jazz patriarchy emerge in the pages of Downbeat. In the 1930s and 1940s, Downbeat positioned jazz as a commodity, and women's bodies, particularly white women's bodies, and their contested musicianship were part of its sales package. As Downbeat writers began to frame jazz in terms of high art and respectability in the 1950s, the magazine shied away from most overtly commercial ties, and images of women, along with representations of their musicianship, subsequently vanished from its pages. By the 1960s and 1970s, with jazz's status as a modern art largely secure, Downbeat writers increasingly agonized over the growing fractures between avant-garde, fusion, and academic jazz, subsequently combining jazz, an already overwhelmingly patriarchal musical space, with other overtly patriarchal forms of music. Ultimately, across this 40-year period, Downbeat's critics and historians developed a jazz language, narrative, and set of values embedded in jazz patriarchy that defined the music and its community, spaces, and history for decades to come. In its early years, Downbeat's articles leaned heavily into the show business aspect of jazz. It featured news and gossip on jazz celebrities, the whereabouts and goings-on of various bands, and technical advice for aspiring musicians. In addition to the tidbits of gossip and access to hep black masculinity that was increasingly becoming more respectable for white men regardless of background, white women became an integral and visible part of Downbeat's sales package. Despite and indeed because of their overwhelming presence in the magazine, the ways in which they were represented fundamentally led to their easy erasure as jazz became historicized in subsequent decades. Downbeat's early years established women's natural and restricted place in jazz as vocalists and highlighted their beauty and bodies, a move that constantly undermined perceptions of their ability. Both of these themes relied on stereotypical patriarchal arguments. One, by insisting on some as only performing roles for sex appeal, women became synonymous with commercialism and therefore simply tangential to real jazz. And 2, by undercutting their abilities, Downbeat reinforced men's supposed natural dominance in the field. These points were demonstrated in the magazine's images, captions, and cartoons, and crucially, in open debates about women's abilities in the jazz field. These debates, which took place in spurts between 1938 and 1951, offer the most direct commentary on what writers, musicians, and audiences of all genders thought of women in jazz. Were they naturally disinclined toward the genre? Did they lack the stamina to perform it? Or did they in fact demonstrate greater endurance than their male counterparts? Were their looks a constant distraction to both them and their audience? Or was it simply another part of the gig at which they excelled? These questions and others reflected similar tensions across US American society, which understood women's natural talents through their bodies as either mothers or sex objects, and most importantly, prioritized white male needs and desires most of all. Downbeat editors seem to have recognized such issues as a particular kind of what we might now call clickbaity conversation that could drive readership, participation, and ultimately sales. Frankly, in the pages of Downbeat, women musicians were not expected to be musicians, and they rarely received the benefit of the assumption of talent, regardless of their role on the bandstand. Take, for example, the big band turned Broadway singer Betty George, whom Downbeat featured on its cover in only her second mention in the magazine. The reason for this seems clear, given the response it gained from reader Joe Wishner, who wrote to the magazine the following month that the cover was it, adding, quote, "She can sing too, can't she?" Critics' reviews reiterated George's sexuality as her primary asset for Downbeat. Women were placed in an impossible situation. If they acquiesced to demands that they be physically beautiful, they suffered the consequence of being written off as nothing but a commercial trick with no real substance. When given the choice between looks and singing, the magazine appeared to have had very clear priorities. Choose the sexy thrush. Images of women were on constant parade within the magazine's pages, including as cartoons, which often portrayed barely clad women struggling to sing well. These women, almost always white, often aren't given space to even say a word. While there were many cartoons featuring large-breasted women with a questionable ability to sing featured in Downbeat in the 1940s, the cover of the July 15th, 1940 issue is particularly striking. It features two white men. One is clearly Benny Goodman, and the other is a desperate, sweating white manager, and one white woman, almost entirely naked, her dress thrown aside on the chair on which she is perched. The caption reads, "Yeah, Benny, but we can give her singing lessons." This was a common refrain across the magazine, simplifying women's presence in the jazz scene to a well-worn trope that denied talent and ability, as the very same critics demanded beauty and sex appeal throughout the 1930s and 1940s. While jazz privileged what Eric Porter calls a, quote, masculine ethos from its beginning, a specific kind of jazz patriarchy emerged later, with the 1950s development of an industry of critics, historians, agents, bookers, promoters, producers, and musicians, whose job it was to craft meaningful narratives about what jazz was and what it meant. The post-World War II years mark a gradual but significant shift in how patriarchy manifested in jazz, as the field's priorities coalesced around masculinity and male dominance in a uniquely jazz patriarchy. And as jazz patriarchy came to define jazz, women were excised from its spaces. The post-World War II commitment to the white GIs, the rise of Cold War tensions, McCarthyism, and the nascent civil rights movement fueled broad anxieties surrounding American masculinity and a retrenchment of traditional gender roles. The critical urge to place bebop within masculine values of art and meaning, as opposed to the feminized consumer space, reflects these widespread masculine anxieties within the United States. Critics increasingly applied the language of canons, greatness, and genius to jazz, each already coded masculine through centuries of Western art discourse. As they did so, they simultaneously erased women in any place they might inhabit. With women's roles in jazz already overwhelmingly relegated to the realm of the commercial, the non-virtuosic, and the entertaining, largely in the role of singer, they were among the first to be left out of a late 1940s and 1950s bebop-focused downbeat. Downbeat's turn away from such cheesecake features was accompanied by an expansion of content that engaged more directly with the music, especially in their record reviews. Reviews became longer and more detailed by the mid-1950s, and as the word count expanded, critics' use of gendered language increased substantially. This is various reviews of Mary Lou Williams, and the years are noted there. As record reviews became a particularly important place to establish jazz musician as an art form, whether that meant as a form of cerebral or political expression, reviewers also increasingly distinguished real instrumental jazz from pop and vocal jazz, and used gender-coded language to categorize jazz sounds. Though in this period, most critics no longer openly debated women's abilities to perform jazz, as we saw in the earlier period, this should not be understood as recognition of women's place in jazz. The disappearance of these debates is due less to the subsiding of jazz patriarchy than to its surreptitious reinforcement across the decades to come. In the early years of downbeat, writers typically used the terms feminine or femininity to simply denote that a band had women. But by the mid-1950s, feminine more often denoted a way of playing, and critics tended to understand femininity and related words like effete or effeminate negatively, to more overtly criticize certain artists or sounds, or to further draw a distinction between a particular artist and a supposed lack of gutsy jazz performance. Backing sounds, especially strings, but also woodwinds, could also be effete and further unnecessary, as Nat Hentoff explains of Milt Jackson's Ballads and Blues. Critics did not always use the term feminine to denote a negative sound, but they always offered a qualification if they intended it as a positive. Critics use the term masculine, on the other hand, as a far more obviously positive description of particular sounds. As an example, a 1962 review proclaimed trumpeter Willie Thomas to be Slide Hampton's, quote, most effective soloists of the day, full of fire and masculinity. Critics' use of the term masculine typically stood in for a host of masculine-coded terms like strong, rough, loud, aggressive, muscular, and gutsy, each of which also was often used to positively describe men's sounds, performances, and compositions. The masculine-coded word that appeared most in Downbeat between 1934 and 1963 was virile, or virility. There was a sharp rise in its usage in the mid-1950s, and it was used to describe men of incredibly varied stylistic approaches. So on the slide is just a sampling of some of the men described as virile. Like masculine, muscular, and aggressive, the definition of virile largely went unstated. It simply was a convenient shorthand that described whether or not a musician had performed well. The 1950s did see a small increase in coverage on women instrumentalists in the magazine, especially on the piano, and this left critics in a difficult position as they increasingly solidified a jazz patriarchal system that valued instrumental jazz over vocal jazz and further defined good instrumental jazz in almost entirely masculine terms. Whereas in the 1930s and 1940s, writers, musicians, and readers openly debated the value of women in jazz on a broader scale, rarely mentioning specific examples of women, 1950s critics tended to bring these debates to bear on specific jazz women instrumentalists in reviews of their work. Visually, critics were agreed. They wanted their girl performers to be, as Leonard Feather described Barbara Carroll, Marion McPartland, Beryl Booker, Bonnie Wetzel, and Elaine Leighton, all girl. Ira Gittler distinguished between Melba Liston's visual appeal and her sound, emphasizing what he liked most about her in overtly gendered terms. Quote, as a woman, she is feminine. As a trombone player, very masculine. But beyond visual appeal, critics were far less clear about their expectations for jazz women's sound. For example, Ralph Gleason wrote in 1957 of Marion McPartland, quote, when I hear a person say of a woman jazz pianist, she plays just like a man, I stop listening. I don't want a woman pianist who plays like a man at all. I want a woman pianist who plays like a woman, and Marion McPartland does this to perfection with taste, warmth, sensitivity, feeling, perception, and all the womanly virtues, as opposed to female bitchiness, in humor, surprise, and accent. But while Gleason wanted women instrumentalists to sound like women, Don DeMichael preferred women who played with strength and muscularity, writing of Bess Bonnier in 1961, quote, most distaff pianists who have made it, I'm speaking in particular of Marion McPartland and Barbara Carroll, let their gender dominate their playing. Not so Miss Bonnier. She digs in with fervor and muscularity. It is particularly striking that these critics didn't feel the need to explain what masculine or feminine was beyond muscular and strong and sensitive or warm. Instead, they assumed that readers would have a common understanding not only of what was masculine and feminine, but how those would be applied to sound. This key sonic dimension of jazz patriarchy, in which masculine sounds were valued and therefore potential of art, made women's place in jazz all the more tenuous. Given the limited forms of representation available to women in downbeat in the 1950s and the lack of coverage of women of color in downbeat in the 1930s and 1940s, it is no surprise that Black women were particularly devalued by the magazine's critics, even as the critics attempted to open more space to them. For example, the data on Downbeat's cover pages disaggregated by race makes it clear that women's representation in the 1930s and 1940s almost wholly meant white women. While Black women and women of color were featured more frequently on Downbeat's covers in the 1950s, this simply meant that instead of having 0 appearances in a given year, they collectively had 1. Culturally, politically, and legally, the 1960s and 1970s represent a period of momentous expansion of the places and spaces available to women across the United States in a movement that would ultimately be referred to as second-wave feminism. Defining where women belonged, where a woman's place was, became a key part of some of these slogans. Consider the distinction between the phrases, a woman's place is in the house versus a woman's place is in the home. Downbeat offered a bit of counter-programming. Having established jazz as a modern art across the 1950s, largely through the language of masculinity, critics further developed a language of patriarchal valorization around three key emerging styles or jazz spaces: avant-garde, rock, and the growing institutionalization of jazz in academia. This off-cited story of jazz's 1960s stylistic fracture has obscured the patriarchal solidarity at play in 1960s and 1970s jazz history. While there are a handful of oblique and typically dismissive reference to the broader world of women's rights and liberation in the pages of Downbeat, its writers were far more concerned with the status of jazz. Such compounding masculinities left even less room for women. The beginning of the 1960s saw the emergence of free jazz, or the new thing, or avant-garde jazz. Kwame Coleman argues that the new thing represented a complete rethinking of the musical fundamentals of jazz, from bebop's focus on harmonic innovation and complexity to a new focus on textural freedom or heterophony. But even more than that, Coleman writes, quote, "The new thing was emblematic of a new radical Black consciousness in the post-World War II era." By the mid-1960s, Downbeat critics increasingly linked free jazz to a particular understanding of Black nationalism, thanks in large part to Amiri Baraka's writing on Archie Shepp. Nearly every jazz scholar working on this period acknowledges the masculinist and misogynist language Baraka used as he developed this relationship, and there's an assortment on the slide. It's no surprise then that incredibly few women involved in free jazz were featured in Downbeat, whether as leaders, soloists, or ensemble members. For example, musicologist Benjamin Pickett describes composer Carla Bley's experience as the only woman invited to join the Jazz Composers Guild. Members of the group apparently initially objected out of deference to Sun Ra's known misogynist belief that women were bad luck. Val Wilmer likewise describes more of the reasons women struggled in the free jazz movement in her crucial work. Jazz's encounter with rock later in the decade similarly combined two predominantly masculinist communities and a bid for art status. Downbeat slowly began to cover rock in the mid-1960s to mixed reader response, and advertisers likewise recognized Downbeat's potential as a masculine rock space. But in 1967, the same year Rolling Stone was founded by Jan Wenner and former Downbeat jazz writer Ralph Gleason, editor Dan Morgenstern wrote a letter to readers explaining that the magazine would officially cover rock music. Anticipating blowback from readers, Morgenstern cited rock's increasing sophistication, rock music's relationship to jazz, rock artists' knowledge of jazz, and insisted upon the magazine's continued high musical standards. In other words, Downbeat's entry into rock criticism determined musical and artistic value largely according to jazz's already patriarchal standards, which combined powerfully with rock's own masculinist leanings. It's also worth mentioning that for a brief window, Downbeat became a primary source for both jazz and rock music reviews and features, boasting higher circulation numbers than Rolling Stone in 1969. The third arena in which jazz patriarchal values compounded in Downbeat in the 1960s and 1970s was in jazz education. Ken Prouty, Tracy McMullen, Phil Ewell, and Dan DiPiero have done important work investigating the white supremacist and patriarchal foundations of jazz education and curricula, including in specific places. I offer a very brief look at Downbeat's contribution to the creation of jazz patriarchal spaces in higher education. The imagery of college bands across Downbeat's pages always reinforced its white male dominance. Overwhelmingly, women were most marked in Downbeat's coverage of jazz on college campuses through their absence. Lists of band members in festivals or other performances and on records typically featured all male names. Downbeat instituted a scholarship contest at this time. The winners were men. BMI advertised the awards it gave to student composers, announcing one of them may be a Beethoven. They were all men. With the appointment of Charles Suber as a publisher in 1968, Downbeat began to highlight jazz in education even more than it had before, including both K-12 and higher education. In one of his regular columns, which was the first non-advertising content within the magazine, Suber analyzed some 175 jazz festivals, elementary school through college, put on in 1973, detailing the numbers of musicians and bands and the numbers of festivals per state. Of women, he writes, quote, "Figures are not available on the number of female players in the school jazz bands, but by personal observation, the women are making it on their own terms and on instruments other than the flute." He continues describing how little participation met the level of making it on their own. Quote, by and large, the average college bands will not average more than 2 female players per band. In senior high school, the percentage would be 4 out of 20. At the junior high level, 8 out of 20. He concludes with, it is rare to find a female player in a jazz combo. I don't know why, ask them. Written shortly after the passage of Title IX, Suber's flippant response speaks volumes about the until recently rather stagnant view of women and girls' participation in jazz. Ask them. Such responses put the blame for women's absence from jazz spaces and rock and avant-garde spaces on them, and further leave them to solve the problem. Not that there was a problem to begin with, just, if they thought there was a problem, they could solve it on their own. In their efforts to frame jazz, whether straight ahead, free, fusion, or education-related as an artistic form, downbeat critics yet again turn to the music itself in their reviews and features. However, as in the 1950s, their analyses overwhelmingly used gendered language as they attempted to determine for their readers which musicians among its wide stylistic spread were musically valid. No matter the style, Downbeat's critics were ultimately largely agreed on a handful of key qualities that defined good jazz. Good jazz, 1, combined technical prowess with emotion. 2, steered clear of commercial gimmicks. 3, made some reference to jazz's past. And 4, demonstrated some kind of unique, original, and/or spontaneous performance. None of these qualities were gender neutral. As Pickett explains, jazz's musical values were prescribed by gender patterning, and, quote, the qualities most admired were volume, raw and extreme emotion, dominating tone, and virtuosic displays of hand and breath control. Critics grafted masculine language on top of masculine language to describe the blending of male-dominant traditions, resulting in a nearly impenetrable wall of patriarchy at the very same time that women were gaining more access and rights elsewhere in society. In the larger project, I go through each of these qualities, comparing reviews of men and women to understand how these characteristics diverged depending upon who was being reviewed, nearly regardless of style, and to chart jazz patriarchy's constant presence in the magazine that defined representational spaces for women in jazz. But for the purposes of this presentation and my few minutes that are left, I focus on Alice Coltrane, reviews of Alice Coltrane following her partner John Coltrane's death. Reviews of Alice Coltrane pinpoint each of these 4 qualities, and while they are unique in their framing around John Coltrane, they nevertheless reveal how the vestiges of gendered musical language compounded over these 4 decades as they constrained the ways women could be successful. One of the basic tests of a jazz musician was their ability to balance the dichotomy between emotion and technique. The ability of a jazz musician to communicate emotion to an audience is an element of jazz patriarchy that differs from a broader US patriarchal culture. While there often was a historical conflation of emotion with femininity and reason with masculinity, as Nicole Rustin argues, jazz masculinity held that, quote, it was the openly emotional man who was seen as most individual, most progressive in thought, and most capable of resisting the trap of conformity. Communicating that emotion required technical skill, or chops. To accommodate women within this dichotomy, certain revisions needed to be made. Women keyboard players needed to demonstrate both masculine and feminine qualities, as we saw in the 1950s. Of a particularly strong performance, reviewer Bill Cole wrote that Alice Coltrane's, quote, right hand is very light and dexterous on the organ, demonstrating her feminine sensibilities. And then while her left hand plays unyielding chords that give strong drone feelings, so demonstrating a more masculine strength. We're moving very quickly through these. We're on number 2 now. Performing with the requisite complexity, both emotion and technique, was one necessary skill. Using those abilities to perform something unique and individual was another. Above all else, good jazz musicians needed to be unique, perform original and spontaneous ideas, and sound like no one else. Needless to say, women were rarely, if ever, described in terms of their individuality. If this quality was mentioned, it was more often in terms of their lack of originality. Alice Coltrane was long trapped in comparisons to John Coltrane's style. In 1972, she was finally described as, quote, vibrant, fresh, innovative, and uncompromising. Still, even the terms used to describe her originality lacked the conviction that most men received. No matter their style, gimmicky music was a non-starter for downbeat critics. Valuable music could have no hint of novelty. Alice Coltrane received some deference from critics in the years immediately following her husband John Coltrane's death in 1967, but by the early 1970s, critic Will Smith repeatedly criticized her for her pretty music and super saccharine, often corny and terribly repetitive strings. In another review, Smith praises any elements he identifies as strong. Quote, "When she does make some strong music, it's worth hearing. Her keyboard work, as a matter of fact, can be enormously powerful, building into waves of energy." Instead, he explains that the album is, quote, "still not much more than pretty music. Not beautiful, just pretty, and that it's mostly sugary." Finally, good jazz reviews nearly always privileged references to jazz's past. But given the historic lack of women recognized and publicized within jazz, particularly as great innovators of the music, historical references were hard to come by for jazz women in this period. This is a category in which Alice Coltrane stands apart from most other women instrumentalists. Though she received minimal coverage before John Coltrane's death, critics became especially interested in her music beginning in about 1969, and they nearly always compared it to John Coltrane's work. In a 1.5-star review of an early album by Alice Coltrane, John Litweiler began not by discussing the album at hand, but with John Coltrane. Quote, "John Coltrane's music was so very personal, the emotion and lyricism so much a part of the man, the externals of his art so seductive and yet misleading, that no other modern musician is such a potentially wrong influence on other musicians." He continued with what appears to be a compliment. Alice Coltrane is the first to assimilate his message almost completely into a personal style. But he reverses this sentiment later in the review, explaining that, quote, "Alice Coltrane has not found her own voice completely in John Coltrane's, and, quote, her harmony and rhythm are completely John Coltrane derived," concluding that she is, quote, "an artist in the process of becoming." Other reviews similarly tie Alice Coltrane to John Coltrane in inspiration and sound, and it's not until Universal Consciousness, her 5th album after John Coltrane's death, that a review of Alice Coltrane does not mention John Coltrane. And unsurprisingly, nearly any comparison to John Coltrane does not measure up to one of jazz's most famous martyrs. In addition to each of the categories above, women needed to fulfill one final category to critics' satisfaction, their looks or sex appeal. As it was at the start of Downbeat's publication history, women in the 1960s and 1970s still had to fulfill critics' expectations for how they looked, and it goes without saying that this was not at all a requirement for male musicians. Indeed, women's looks were an integral part of their package, often inseparable from their music. Reviews of live performances especially focused on women's appearance and movements, and this was especially true of vocalists. Writing of Alice Coltrane's performance at the John Coltrane Memorial Concert, Richard Seidel used Alice Coltrane's looks to offset what he disliked about her music. Quote, "Pictures on album covers cannot fully convey Mrs. Coltrane's beauty. Her smiling presence radiated a spiritual glow throughout the hall. Unfortunately, these good feelings were not always complemented successfully by her music," end quote. In this case, as with others, it seems that male critics understood an acceptable compliment sandwich to incorporate an assessment of a woman's looks with a critique of their music. Importantly, this is not a story of a single or even just a handful of downbeat critics, however influential, crafting particular patriarchal narratives. This was the downbeat standard of practice, to define jazz in gendered ways that increasingly seemed to erase gender, even as it restricted women's place in jazz through a tangled web of patriarchal forces. So, jazz has not been a space for women, non-binary, and trans folks. Growing up, jazz places, for me, were high school auditoriums and gymnasiums and concert halls on Midwestern college campuses. And while my gender was marked in abundant other ways, and what I was told to wear and the features that I played, and it was always clear that being a girl in jazz was something unique outside of my high school, it never occurred to me that jazz might not have a place for me until I got to college and experienced the inevitable gender cliff. If I had been asked why I quit jazz band in my sophomore year of college, I could have given any number of answers unrelated to my gender. I was a piano major trying to also play trumpet in the top jazz band, or I had been offered an accompanying gig that would take considerable additional time. These were valid reasons we could all feel good about, myself, my bandmates, my director, But what I've come to realize is that jazz was no longer a space for me. As the only woman in that particular band, I prioritized my safety in a group of older men I didn't know very well, which created distance and sabotaged my sense of community. And I missed that community without even knowing it. When we talk about space and place, we often focus on who and what occupies space, who or what has a physical presence. Women, non-binary, and trans folks have often operated in liminal spaces. We are both more present than has been historically recognized, and we are also not there in place. That absence is the responsibility of everyone within jazz places. We must continue the ongoing work of examining jazz's patriarchal foundations in order to fully realize what it would mean for women to have a place and take up space in jazz. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to find out what is the situation today with women in jazz? Is because we still have jazz magazines that you read, and and so what's the situation? Are they still looking at jazz artists, woman jazz artists, as far as their looks, their appearance, rather than really their talent? Is that still going on?
That's a really good question. In terms of what Downbeat's doing, that I can't answer because I am only to 1974. But more broadly, yeah. Well, there's one story that I kind of want to share. I was working with one of my students, and we were looking at the Downbeat website for the news that Alexa Tarantino was the first full-time female member of Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra in the year of our Lord 2025. What we noticed, that announcement was made like somewhere around March 4th. March is Women's History Month. Oh, okay. Two, we were looking at on the Downbeat website, and there were these weird advertisements of like Downbeat t-shirts that were like form-fitted to like a woman's fit, like with like a woman with breasts. And that is not how their advertisements normally look. Their advertisements are generally like pretty like straight. It's a straight t-shirt fit. And again, it was March that we were looking at this. And so, and when I looked later, like in April and May, those were not the ads that were there. They were sort of the more typical ads. And so from just that anecdotal evidence, I would say that people are not overtly saying like, hey, that smile's really doing it. But they are sort of still using the language of imagery in sort of these kind of more cloaked ways to say like, oh, we know it's Women's History Month, and we know that since it's Women's History Month, you want to read this article on Alexa Tarantino, so we're going to advertise some shirts for you, and just sort of mapping it all onto each other. I think if you look at any university band, you're going to see the gender cliff. You're going to see one, maybe two women in that jazz band, which is a sort of interesting thing because a lot of the jazz musicians that I follow right now are women. Like the professional jazz musicians that I follow are women, and it's because I think what they're doing is cool. And yes, I do like going to see women, but there is this kind of other representational space being held in jazz, in live music, but not on college campuses.
Yeah, because I haven't seen a jazz group performing at Jazz at Lincoln Center, or not all female. You might see one female in the whole band.
Yeah, and here I want to hat tip Kim Teal. Kim Teal has written about various places, but about Mary Lou Williams' use in those spaces and how these places can use one jazz woman, one very famous jazz woman, to say, look, we do gender. Just look over here. And rather than employing and hiring women regularly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. This is such great work. I was struck by the word virile that came up because I did this little project once where I was just looking at coverage of Bill Evans and Downbeat, and I was just shocked by the number of times that word was used, and just in other kinds of like sexual imagery around his playing. I remember there was something about like him spurting out phrases like a geyser and all like kinds of stuff like that. So I was wondering if you saw other examples in your Downbeat reading of like sexual framing of men and masculinity.
Yes, but honestly, virile is the biggest one, and I can't remember at the top of my head the number, but the number was just I have a chart where I just charted it because it was like, what is happening? The expansion in about 1956 and 57 is where you see that growth, and what I have thought of it as is thinking in terms of Ingrid Monson's arguments about the 1950s and how this is a time period when Downbeat in particular, you have these white critics, and generally they're all like the progressive white good guys, right? And so they are becoming engaged in civil rights via Downbeat and kind of saying, okay, we're going to really prioritize Black musicians. And weirdly, at that same time, the use of the word virile just shoots up. So it's really just confirming all of those kind of white male, like in her article on white hipness, just those white male obsessions with Black masculinity and Black sexual masculinity in that period. Yeah.
So thinking about that, do you have any reviews of little Jimmy Scott? So there was an African American male, and how was he defined as a singer or performer?
I'm not gonna lie. I'm sure I have his reviews. They are not in my brain. Who is coming to mind right now? I think one thing that sort of comes to mind. The thing that comes to mind is sort of more in terms of the women who are described as virile, because there are 5 women who are described as virile. So that's not going to answer your question. That is going to take us in a different way. Yeah.
To use your argument now,
Yeah.
you're switching in the 60s, it's what virile is Black and male. Here's a Black male that wouldn't be there. I'm curious to see how.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is in that switch to 50 in 1956 and 57 where we see that increase. That is where you start to see it used slightly more for Black men than for white men. White men still get in there, but you see the kind of numbers just shift slightly more to Black men. So I would have to go back and look at him specifically to see. And there are so many people to compare. It's a very interesting morass of things. Yeah.
Oh, in response to John, I might recommend Nina Eidesheim has a great chapter on Jimmy Scott in her book, The Race of Sound, that delves with some of these intersections of gender, race, and disability as well. So that might be a place to look. It's a great chapter. But what I was going to ask is the discussion of today and sort of extending this to today made me think a little bit. I think it was Lara Peregrinelli in 2019 was responding to an article that sort of framed it as like 2019 was the year of women in jazz, like they've finally arrived. And there's plenty to critique about that. And one of the critiques she makes is that this was a story that she had been hearing over and over. That and she talks about now we're hearing about these artists. 10 years ago, we were hearing about Ingrid Jensen and this other wave. And I wonder if you see any of that happening up to the point in 1974. Is it still sort of just bald-faced misogyny happening, or if you start to see this sort of self-congratulatory aspect that never really comes to fruition?
Honestly, no. They are so in the 1950s. You will see so we have that period in the 30s and 40s where they're outwardly debating like, can women even play in jazz? That kind of thing. In the 1950s, you do have a few critics who are saying like Leonard Feather is an is the primary example of who are saying, yes, women can play, and look at all of these women that I know. And he starts a column called Girls in Jazz, where he is a very short-lived column, but where he focuses on like one female jazz musician per column. It only runs for like maybe a year, maybe not even a year. So you see some work sort of moving, and then honestly, when we hit the 60s and 70s, they just really aren't talking about the absence of women in jazz nearly to the extent that they were in the 50s. Every once in a while, you'll get some kind of snide remark like, "Oh, well, the women's libbers would say blah blah blah." Like you'll get that's sort of the main reference, except for the Charles Suber. He would be the only one, and he's looking specifically at education. He's sort of the only one who does specifically comment on it. He is usually doing it in a way that says, "Well, just ask them," or like, "That's a problem for them to figure out." But he's kind of the only one in that time period up to 74 that's even really mentioning that there aren't very many women. Yeah.
Just one quick comment that it's a wonderful paper, and I like the arc we have going here now, and a number of the presentations, thinking about this one and thinking about the festivals, makes me wonder about what the primacy of a criticism is first, or like why we assign it power in the reception of the music. And also the adjacency of the magazine to audiophilia, not to be a one-trick pony with technology, but even within your period that you're at now, or the range that you have now, the rise of the home sound system and the adjacency of a masculinity, hyper-masculinity associated with hoarding gear and using jazz records to sort of say something about one's possessions more than anything musical. Makes me wonder about the crosstalk there is in this discourse in the magazine and that technological life as gendered. Not to take you beyond 74 today, I know, but the matter of what the life of a printed magazine is now means, I would presume, some sort of disempowerment of this masculinist discourse. So I just wonder about the media side of what these expressions were animating.
Yeah, that's a very rich and very good question. I think in terms of the technological part, that is something that I've sort of played with, because there are just really interesting advertisements, particularly in the 50s, especially for like home stereo systems that are, on the one hand, some of them are deeply like specific, and it's very clear, like, we're talking to you guys, like. But then there's also other ones, like there's one where it's like this guy, I think they're selling like headphones or something like that, and it has like this like little old granny lady, and they're like, headphones even your landlady will love. But then there are also, I think this is coming from Darren Miller, his work on like LPs, that there are a subset of sort of advertisements that actually do target women because they saw that technology at that period as a form of as furniture. So who buys and picks out and designs around furniture? And so there are some that are going that way. But in terms of like, yeah, from 1974 to roughly today, I think what my overview is going to probably focus on, I think I'm going to go through like 95 or 2000, because I think in that internet bubble phase, or that space where the internet becomes the space where sharing about ideas, I think that is where we see, I like the phrase that you use, the disempowerment of these spaces. And I am interested to see how that operates, particularly as we get into the 90s and we get into this other sort of this, if we're doing a wave feminism, a sort of third wave of feminism, how it interacts with that, and if it still has utility. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the paper. It's really revealing. Makes me want to go back to the magazines and look again and see what I'll see. But I really want to pick up on John's point about this little Jimmy Scott. And in Will Friedwald's book, he tries to divide, just talking about singers, the white and black singers, according to some being more rough, aggressive, grainy,
Yeah.
the black ones, and the cool, detached intellectuals on the other hand. And I think he wouldn't do that today because it's too obvious a mistake.
I was doing some volunteer work with a nonprofit jazz group that will remain nameless, and they in their promotional materials that they were writing for jazz musicians did a little of that.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
But I wonder about these in-between figures like Chet Baker, who's singing the way he sings, or Ray Charles, who has his record where he sings all falsetto versions of things, or somebody like Johnny Hartman. I wonder, maybe it's irrelevant to your project, but I'm just wondering about those.
It's not irrelevant. I just wish that I had like a file of facts in my brain to shift through. But as I recall with Chet Baker, it does depend a little bit that in that later period when he is singing, sometimes, I'm not sure if, I think the word virile is used at least once, but sometimes it's seen as like, oh, you are exhibiting this masculinity, and sometimes it's not. And so I think that might get into the level of who is reviewing him, because he is one that will get both of those reviews of like masculinity or femininity. But in terms of the others, I would have to look. Yeah, I want to make a spreadsheet and just. Yes. Yeah.
I have the Johnny
Yeah.
Hartman one in my file of facts. Which is
Okay.
great.
Excellent.
They talk about Johnny Hartman in this way. Sorry, where the reviews actually frame him as either jazz or not jazz based on perceived masculinity. I think so. Like his John Coltrane moment is embraced, but then they start to talk about him as like, well, we thought the rest of his recordings would be jazz, but they're not real jazz. They're these like sad, sappy ballads. What's going on? And so I think there's a certain sense of like, oh, he's too soft to be jazzy.
Can we give Professor Klotz a round of applause? All right, thanks again. We're running a few minutes behind again, but it's all manageable. We might have a shorter coffee break yet again. But thank you, Kelsey Klotz. Our next speaker is Christi J. Wells. Christi J. Wells is an associate professor of musicology at Arizona State University's School of Music, Dance, and Theater. An interdisciplinary scholar in the fields of jazz history, popular music studies, dance studies, and arts and cultural policy, they received their doctorate in 2014 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her doctoral dissertation on drummer band leader Chick Webb and swing music in Harlem during the Depression received the Society for American Music's Wiley Housewright Dissertation Award and UNC's Glenn Hayden Award for an outstanding dissertation in musicology. She have also received Venemus Edgar A. Toppin Award for outstanding research in African American music, a Morrow Berger Benny Carter Jazz Research Fellowship from the Institute of Jazz Studies, and the Irving Loewens Article Award from the Society for American Music. A social jazz and blues dancer for 20 years, Wells has been a lecturer and clinician at national and international dance workshops. Their first book, Between Beats, The Jazz Tradition and Black Vernacular Dance, explores the complex intersections between jazz, social, and popular dance, race, power, and discourse from the 19th through the 21st century. Between Beats received the Kealana Homoko Award from the Society for Ethnomusicology's Dance Movement and Gesture section, and was a finalist for the Dance Studies Association's De La Torre Bueno First Book Award and the Woody Guthrie First Book Award from the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, U.S. branch. She has published articles in the journals Women in Music, Jazz and Culture, Journal of the Society for American Music, and Daedalus, and have multiple chapters on jazz dance history topics for volumes in the Oxford Handbook series. They are currently working on their second book, a study of the Smithsonian Institution's substantial history of jazz programming and patronage. And her talk's name is The Museum's Jumpin', Mapping the Smithsonian's Institutional Rhythms. Please welcome Christi J. Wells.
Hi, thanks everyone so much for having me. As I was telling Tom before, you really did a wonderful job, I think, curating this selection of speakers. It feels like a real luxury and a gift to be speaking at this point in the program just because of all of the uncanny resonances with various things that people have said today. So themes of Black neighborhoods, highways, and kind of segregated urban design, themes of curation and institutional kind of boundaries over who gets to do what and when and where, and issues of kind of which musics are and are not included in jazz and what kinds of representational power those have. Those are all going to be themes kind of among more that come up in this. So there are certain things that just to share a lot of really cool archival work, I don't get to dig into the implications of so much. So I'm very glad that the speakers before me kind of have done that legwork, and some of those things should be apparent as I'm going through all this. In his memoir, Smithsonian Impresario, James R. Morris, who led the Smithsonian's Division of Performing Arts from its founding in 1966 to its dissolution in 1983, recalled a dispute at the 1971 Festival of American Folklife between the recently hired jazz critic Martin Williams and the folklorist Ralph Rinzler. Objecting to what he saw as a young black blues musician's mediocre performance at the festival, Williams argued that in programming the musician because of his significance to his community, Rinzler was denigrating great artists, both black and white, and reflecting what Williams saw as a paternalistic attitude and a Marxist ideology among folklorists. Morris labeled the dispute a prophetic controversy, and indeed it would frame a larger fissure between Williams and Rinzler, and thus between the Smithsonian's jazz program and its folklore infrastructure throughout the 1970s. Williams explained his grievances with the folkloric paradigm in, among other places, a 1978 letter to the editorial staff of the Journal of Jazz Studies, in which he voiced his objection to their publication of Frank Kovsky's, quote, defensive Procrustean attempt to subsume jazz, a sublime expression of the ultimate value of the individual, into the crude Marxist-Leninist prescriptions which hold that the age of individuality is over and that mankind is to be understood only as a set of reactions to the social forces, and social forces are in quotes in the letter. This acrimony in the 1970s between two firm ideological poles, which I think can at least partially explain an entrenched administrative fissure at the Smithsonian between jazz programming and that for all other forms of Black American music and culture, stands in contrast to a brief period in the late 1960s before Williams's tenure, when tensions between the lionization of transcendent individuals and the emphasis on community embeddedness, between the Smithsonian's prestigious imprimatur and local neighborhood-driven advocacy, resulted in more of a negotiated synthesis than a polarized split. So today I'm going to focus on a particular moment when the Smithsonian's nascent jazz programming was on a different path before Williams's commitment to the new criticism, which he learned as a graduate student right here at Columbia University, rerouted its epistemological contours. Toward that end, I'll be discussing two Smithsonian initiatives: a concert series in its Division of Performing Arts and an exhibition at the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum. The Smithsonian founded its Division of Performing Arts, its first arts presenting focused unit, in 1966, tapping opera singer and arts administrator James Morris to head the new division. The DPA met with early success by arranging the Smithsonian's first Folklife Festival on the National Mall. Though his background was in classical music, Morris had strong convictions about using his curatorial platform as a means to lobby more broadly for cultural and racial diversity in the Smithsonian's programming. Morris would later reflect on the particular importance of foregrounding Black American music and culture in his division's work. He writes, "To understand the deeper social meanings of the music of Black Americans was a task beyond my capabilities, but I believed institutions like the Smithsonian, where the arts of many cultures are preserved, studied, and explained, had a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity to address the subject. As Morris recalled, whenever there was an opportunity, I pushed the subject of racial imbalance in Smithsonian priorities. I could sense the discomfort that my pushing caused." Morris also noted a dearth of programming focused on popular culture, and he saw jazz as a particularly strong candidate for advocacy, seeing it as a bridge between the realm of the popular and the tastes and sensibilities of those interested in ostensibly more serious art forms. Jazz presentations, Morris reflected, would lend credibility to our goal of presenting overlooked and ignored aspects of American culture. I also thought we might begin to bridge the Smithsonian's problems with race. Toward that end, Morris's DPA produced a series of concerts in partnership with the Left Bank Jazz Society, a nonprofit jazz presenting and advocacy organization founded in Baltimore in 1964, with the goal to, quote, create a social and cultural climate in which jazz can be better enjoyed and advanced, and to reach audiences that might not otherwise be reached. The Washington, D.C. chapter was formed in 1966 and set itself the task of, quote, fostering an appreciation and support for jazz in addition to aiding underprivileged children in the area. Initially, they produced weekly concerts featuring local musicians at Barnett's Crystal Room in Northeast D.C., though they aspired, like their Baltimore forebears, to bring musicians with national reputations. In addition to these concerts, the club held listening sessions where members listened to recordings of past Left Bank performances. The group grew rapidly from 12 initial members to over 450 by the end of 1967. Much of their advocacy work during this time period centered on lobbying for a dedicated jazz radio station in Washington, D.C.'s metro area, articulating the urgent need both locally and nationally thus. For too long now, the cultural input of jazz music has been denied a listening audience in this city, other cities in the US, and abroad. A very serious form of genocide is being enacted upon this music, the repercussions of which are far-reaching. The closing or converting to discotheques of well-known jazz homes, the loss in sales to musicians and performers due to a lack of publicity, to name a few. Eventually, America stands to lose its only cultural contribution to the world. We do not intend to stand idly by while this happens. Given the focus of our symposium today, I do want to note here the spatial dimensions of the cultural genocide that Left Bank outlines here, as they see their fight as one to preserve heritage sites and to reclaim lost venues, both brick and mortar and on the airwaves. For the Division of Performing Arts, the partnership was one of necessity, as Morris's applications for funding for a Smithsonian Jazz Concert Series had been repeatedly rejected, whereas the Left Bank Jazz Society of Washington, D.C. had a functioning model for mounting such concerts. The DPA could, however, offer significant in-kind support in the form of access to the Smithsonian's facilities. Left Bank, in turn, had experience both with fundraising and with producing jazz performances, as well as a substantial jazz knowledge base and connections with prominent artists. As the series took shape, the LBJS took responsibility for booking and paying artists and for selling tickets, and the DPA provided the Baird Auditorium at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, a venue with a seating capacity of 535. In alignment with its mission of keeping jazz affordable and accessible, Left Bank charged $2 for admission, which admittedly is about $17 or $18 in 2025, but everything's kind of wild in 2025. In addition to featuring mainstream jazz artists, Left Bank used the concerts as a platform to experiment and to feature local DC artists. At their September 1970 concert with the Horace Silver Quintet, they featured during intermission a presentation called The Spectacles, which their newsletter described as, quote, a psychedelic fashion show put on by some hip Washington youngsters. The concerts consistently filled the hall, though they also exposed some of the challenges of expecting a lecture hall to serve as a concert venue. Many among us, I'm sure, can relate to this issue. In order to rectify acoustic shortcomings, Morris sought and did receive internal funding to build a floating ceiling. Of a 1969 concert featuring the Donald Byrd Quintet, Holly West of the Washington Post noted that, quote, the acoustics were excellent in all parts of the room. In 1969 and 1970, the Left Bank Smithsonian concerts featured ensembles led by major artists including Horace Silver, Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie, Lee Morgan, Betty Carter, and Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Gillespie's October 1970 concert featured his classic repertoire as well as his new work, specifically The Brother K, a piece dedicated to the recently assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. West also had high praise for a November 1970 Lee Morgan Quartet performance, which he described as funky and soulful, offering an account of the crowd response, quote, "The 650 persons present applauded, snapped fingers, clapped hands in rhythm, and rhymed with gusto." And I don't know if that number is misstating the audience or if they were exceeding capacity, but I assume the statute of limitations is up on that. The partnership proved fruitful for both parties. For the Left Bank Jazz Society, free use of Baird Auditorium solved two problems they had identified with their previous venues. They were logistically difficult to access for their large suburban membership, and they charged enough to be financially inaccessible for the urban audience they had sought to reach and attract. In addition to the concerts in Baird, the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum provided space for Left Bank to hold their membership meetings, affording the group what their president, Gil Crampton, described as a, quote, "solid base of operations," through which they were able to double their membership in 1969. Morris later reflected that despite understandable trepidation on the part of concertgoers, the performances themselves ultimately won over the crowds. As Morris recounts, quote, "The first predominantly black audiences in Smithsonian history approached the museum warily, like entering foreign territory. But they were into the music. They listened and responded, at first with murmurs of approval, and then with shouts of yeah, or all right." Morris was, of course, not the only Smithsonian administrator to note with some consternation that its museums and events on the National Mall seemed to alienate and deter black patrons. The Smithsonian secretary at the time, S. Dillon Ripley, sought to improve the situation by extending the Smithsonian's reach into DC's black enclaves. As he explained in the Smithsonian Year publication of 1967, many people who could be greatly benefited by going to museums, who could have latent interests aroused, or who would be ripe for open education, undidactic, unstressed, never get to museums. Some live in poor neighborhoods out of which they do not travel. Some are inherently hostile toward marble palaces. The suggestion is then that we help a local committee in some urban area plan a neighborhood museum. That year, the Smithsonian opened the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum. Driven by his broader concern about the social and moral health of communities, one aspect of his interest in quote-unquote social biology, Ripley felt museums had to actually pique the interest of and be meaningful to a broad range of people in order to fulfill their potential to contribute to transformative social impact. Yet in referring to people who live in poor neighborhoods out of which they do not travel, Ripley was of course accessing a specific and pervasive stereotype, often applied to the predominantly black residents of Southeast Washington, D.C.'s Anacostia neighborhood, as to many black people who live in urban areas. A phenomenon he misattributes here to disposition rather than to the myriad infrastructure policies from highway construction disrupting black neighborhoods to public transit divestment that impacted Anacostia residents' urban mobility. In any event, that the Smithsonian would place their first neighborhood museum specifically in Anacostia ultimately had less to do with Ripley's aspirations or assumptions than with the work of an existing cadre of local activists led by Margaret Hope, who had long pushed for a museum in their neighborhood. These community advocates recognized the opportunity Ripley's interest in opening a neighborhood museum presented and successfully lobbied for Anacostia as its location. In addition to lobbying for the museum to be placed in Anacostia, Hope and her cohort also succeeded in having John Kennard, a local activist and minister, hired as the new museum's founding director. Kennard's vision for the museum differed fundamentally from that of Ripley and other Smithsonian power brokers, who had hoped it would serve largely as a satellite outpost to feature existing Smithsonian collections and function as a pipeline to attract Anacostia residents to the Smithsonian's museums on DC's National Mall in greater numbers. Kennard, however, felt strongly that the new museum should serve primarily as a community-centered cultural resource. In the 1969 Smithsonian Year publication, Kennard articulated his vision for a neighborhood museum. The neighborhood museum must meet the practical needs of its community. Indeed, its existence is predicated upon the proposition that there are critical needs to be met. The neighborhood museum exists to articulate those needs, to graphically illustrate those needs, and to take firm action that will provide for creative satisfaction of those needs. it must attract a significant number of neighborhood people on all levels to ensure its involvement and strengths. It should also make every effort to analyze and interpret the history of its community. Kennard and his team worked within this paradigm from the outset, producing innovative exhibitions and programs that would have far-ranging influence on museums more broadly. Among the most famous of these is the 1969 exhibition, The Rat, Man's Invited Affliction, an exploration of rats in urban environments that, in historian Robin Autry's words, reflected the frustration with rat infestation in the neighborhood and featured a simulated backyard with live rats. Autry argues that, quote, the exhibition paved a way for the positioning of the museum as a generative space within which the past, present, and future were strategically linked as a form of social commentary. Within this visual and textual language of identity, the viscerality of the everyday is afforded primacy as evidence of both social inequalities and Black perseverance. Kennard's forward-thinking paradigm certainly included featuring the arts, though again his perspective focused less on celebrating a canon of masters than on any exhibit's community impact. As he explained, quote, in preference to an exhibit of the works of a Michelangelo or Raphael, the logical starting point for projects in the arts is the creative potential of the neighborhood residents and what they are able to achieve. In 1968, a year prior to the famed rat exhibit, the Smithsonian Office of its Exhibits surveyed local residents in Anacostia and prepared for the museum a, quote, analytical interpretation of 20 proposed exhibits suggested by the community. Of the exhibition themes most ubiquitously proposed by local residents, the history of jazz was the lone performing arts topic. The exhibit that followed this report, This Thing Called Jazz, was mounted from December 1968 through mid-January 1969, and was forged through collaboration between the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum's Youth Advisory Committee and the staffs of that museum, the Smithsonian's Office of Exhibits, and the Museum of History and Technology's Division of Musical Instruments. At its core, however, the jazz exhibit stemmed from ideas and suggestions of the Youth Advisory Committee, who came up with the exhibit's title and whose contributions were vetted and executed by both the Anacostia Neighborhood Museums Advisory Committee and the Smithsonian's Office of Exhibits. The exhibit spanned across the museum's various spaces and permanent installations. At the museum's country store, one could observe as, quote, small-town gents while away the time making their own music with typical jazz combo instruments. These small-town gents were wire figure silhouettes from which were suspended musical instruments provided by DC Public Schools' music department, which also furnished music teachers, jazz musicians themselves, to offer live demonstrations of these instruments. A press release from the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum describes the exhibit in detail, offering a spatial narration of what a prospective visitor could expect. Greeting the visitor as he enters the museum will be photographs of Washington jazz musicians and of Washington jazz performances. The show leads immediately into a special exhibit concept, the environmental room. In this room, roughly 12 feet by 14 feet in dimension, films, slides, and the rousing sound of a New Orleans marching band will surround the viewer with a parade through the old section of New Orleans. On hand will be typical jazz combo instruments. There will be demonstration of these, as well as opportunities for youngsters to try them out themselves. A jazz history section includes photographs, mementos, and actual instruments of such great performers as Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Sidney Bechet, and Bix Beiderbecke. A tape of great jazz recordings through the century will be included to introduce the novice to this exciting art form and to awaken pleasant memories for the jazz buff. The link with modern times will be a jukebox, programmed with the music that is currently being heard on the top 10. Teenagers can dance to the music they want under the pictures of the artists who are today's great lights. Herman Schaden, staff writer for the Washington Star, visited the exhibit and described his experience thus. It's 4 p.m. Sunday in the museum, a time and place traditionally equated with quiet contemplation. Somebody trips the jukebox and Cannonball Adderley erupts, followed by Aretha Franklin moaning Lady Soul. In the environmental room, Giant moving pictures on the walls show the onward band of New Orleans marching along blaring Dixieland music. Dizzy Gillespie is followed by Charles Hampton's quintet, and before you know it, the museum's jumping, and the teenagers are dancing, and quiet contemplation is a thing of the past. The aforementioned environmental room was created using original footage shot by Smithsonian staff on location of a contemporary parade in New Orleans featuring the Onward Brass Band. The Smithsonian Torch described this environmental room as, quote, an exhibit's technique to make the visitor feel like an actual participant in a New Orleans jazz parade by surrounding him with films, slides, and recordings of a band marching through the city's famous French Quarter. Here's some of the immersive footage they shot and that would have appeared in this environmental room. Oh, it doesn't seem to want to do my time. And I had cut this from the presentation for time, but I think I kind of called an audible today with some of what other people were talking about. In that press release, they mentioned an audio narration that went throughout the museum. I waited in a digitization queue for about a year and a half, and the Smithsonian finally digitized that audio recording. So here's the beginning of Douglas Moore initiating this recording of great jazz musicians that would play when you were in the exhibit. And it proceeds on from there to feature Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and if my memory is not failing me, Benny Goodman, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane. What we might consider the contours of the jazz history narrative you'd regularly hear in a jazz studies, introduction to jazz studies class today. And I do want to note in talking about how long it took to get this digitized, please do not take this as any kind of a dig toward the Smithsonian staff. I say it more to underscore how much incredible material they have that needs to be digitally preserved and made accessible, and that they need the funding to hire enough staff to service the needs of the incredible materials they hold. So just advocating for that briefly. The exhibit was also bolstered by regular live concert programming, including a performance at its opening by the Charles Hampton Band, and subsequent concerts included a weekly Saturday performance for the exhibit's first 3 weeks by the Lynn Covington Quartet, and single performances from the GTOs, the Roberta Flack Trio, the Invitations, the Destinations, and the Shirley Horn Trio. There was also a memorial concert held to honor the recently deceased John Coltrane, which featured the Sonny Gilliard Quintet. The museum also featured gospel performances from Marguerite Santiago and from the youth choir of the Bethlehem Baptist Church. In inviting Bethlehem's choir to perform, John Kennard expressed his belief that gospel belonged with this exhibit because, quote, gospel music is so inextricably intertwined with our other musical forms. Notably, the selections for the exhibit's jukebox were, again, made by the Youth Advisory Council. This collaboration between the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum's Youth Advisory Council, the museum's own staff, and other Smithsonian units existed within a tension between the Smithsonian central leadership and the Anacostia museums over the new museum's purpose and structure. As I stated earlier, Ripley and his cohort had hoped to use existing materials to bolster Black patronage of its museums on the National Mall, whereas Kennard and his team in Anacostia were offering innovative exhibitions and programs that reflected and were directly relevant to the lives of Anacostia residents. This tension is itself clearly present in the exhibit's content and in the language in its program booklet. Though, as I've outlined, the exhibit's programming and interactive elements did feature local jazz musicians and educators, this thing called jazz does appear to have placed the bulk of its focus not on Anacostia's own music making or on DC's jazz scene, but on nationally prominent figures who were at this point largely accepted within an emergent canonic jazz history narrative. Both the musicians featured and the emphasis on New Orleans as a source of the tradition evince a strong alignment with what John Gennari has described as the consensus history approach championed by jazz scholar Marshall Stearns a decade prior. And I'm basing that on a lot of the content of what's listed in the program booklet, what are described as the instruments that are put on display, who's featured in the exhibit, and as you heard a little bit of, the audio narration that accompanied it. Indeed, given Kennard's perspective that a performing arts exhibit should feature neighborhood achievements rather than canonic masterworks, it seems on face out of sync with this goal that this thing called jazz focused so much on broadly celebrated heroes of the jazz canon and on the cultural geography of New Orleans more so than that of Washington, D.C. However, the concert programming, live demonstrations, and involvement of local music educators suggests a clear connection between the national and the local. Furthermore, oral history interviews with the Smithsonian exhibition staff and with former members of the Anacostia Museum's Youth Advisory Committee, at least in what I've found so far, point toward a positive collaborative working relationship. And while there were broader tensions regarding institutional priorities and community needs, there is no specific evidence I've yet found of conflict among the people who actually collaborated on this exhibit in particular. Rather, Youth Advisory Council members recalled positively their experience of visiting the National Mall with Smithsonian staff and choosing the materials from existing collections to include in the exhibit. Christopher Reynolds recalled of his experience as a teenager working on the exhibit through the Youth Advisory Committee with the Smithsonian staff, with whom they collaborated, that, quote, "They opened us to the fact that the Smithsonian itself had so much that we could draw on that it was just fascinating. You mean we could actually get this instrument from that artist and these recordings? It was really quite interesting. We actually went down to the main museum to take a look at some of the artifacts and help to choose them. And we also became such a strong part of the museum's volunteer work that we literally ran it on weekends." And I'll just note his use of the term main museum in there as well. I often talk about the idea of hegemony as unmarked with my students and ask them to think about in various universities which campus is considered the main campus. Though it did include materials brought in from the National Mall, this thing called jazz went far beyond simply deigning to display the Smithsonian's treasures to an Anacostia audience. From the youth volunteers who curated the objects and painted the exhibit's murals to the local musicians and educators who took part in the exhibit's progressive interactive components, this was a Smithsonian jazz exhibit specific to Anacostia. It was of its community. In both Anacostia's This Thing Called Jazz and the Left Bank Jazz Society DPA collaborations, we see a period in the late 1960s where the Smithsonian's jazz work featured significant involvement from predominantly Black community organizations. While marked at times with understandable mistrust, a need for cultural translation, and a degree of negotiation between conflicting interests, these efforts resulted in a solid melding of the Smithsonian's institutional resources with the guidance, subject matter expertise, and cultural knowledge of Black DC residents. In my first book, Between Beats, through the concept of choreographies of listening, I explored the conditions and constraints of possibility that power structures and narratives place upon the dancing and non-dancing bodies alike of jazz's listeners, and how those bodies respond to create new realities in the perpetual tension to be found along the spectrum between defiance and acquiescence. In my current work exploring the bureaucratic contours of the Smithsonian Institution's extensive history of jazz patronage and programming, I'm teasing out what I'm currently terming institutional rhythms, borrowing from and building on Ingrid Monson's idea that jazz's rhythm sections offer soloists a participant framework to investigate. And I'm trying to investigate those frameworks. This works better in prose. I should have marked where I need to have emphasis. I'm going to take that sentence again. I'm teasing out what I'm currently terming institutional rhythms, borrowing from and building on Ingrid Monson's idea that jazz rhythm sections offer soloists a participant framework, to investigate those frameworks through which institutions both support and foreclose participation, and the bureaucratic minutiae that sediment the fissures of past disputes and archive ideologies whose overwhelming resonances often obscure the conjuncturally specific idiosyncrasies that birthed them. Nina Eidsheim has defined choreography as, quote, an external structural force that, with decisive power that ranges from coercion to suggestion, funnels the body through certain movements and stances rather than others. And here I see a clear connection between choreography and the study of institutions. I'm interested in the peculiarities of how institutional bureaucracies form structuring paradigms in the arts, and under what circumstances a given paradigm will either shift and fade or yield a ubiquitous field-wide habitus that comes to feel natural and even unmovable due to what Lauren Kajikawa, following George Lipsitz, identifies as our institutionally entrenched possessive investments. I'm hopeful that the specificities of institutional history can help us to destabilize these investments and collectively envision how things could have been otherwise, and thus how they still could be. Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating paper, and also one that has a lot of layers when we consider what we're talking about today in terms of space and place, because you're talking about a lot of different physical spaces and a lot of different places that are created and recreated, especially when we talk about that experience room, or I can't remember the term for it, but the one where there's the immersive exhibit.
Oh, the environmental room.
Environmental room, yeah. Pardon me, like where we have this, I mean, this whole exhibit sounds like it's very much before its time, right? But in terms of considering space and place, I would love to hear a little bit more about what you think the music offered, given that this was a musical exhibit, and that it was jazz as well, or jazz and blues and some other things too, how the music may have contributed to the making and remaking of those places in this space that has been dedicated to the community, has been dedicated to Anacostia.
That's a great question. First, thank you for assuaging my anxiety that I was on theme and wasn't just kind of using this to work out some stuff that had been on my mind. So I'm glad that worked out. To answer your question, one, I think in calling this exhibit ahead of its time, I think part of the point may be that we could think about it that way, but I think we can also think about it as meaningfully of its time in a way that was in that moment atypical for museums, with a kind of preservationist historical gaze. So there's that on the one hand. And to answer your question about music, I think that's a bit of what I was trying to get at, is that music's doing quite a lot of things in this exhibit. And for one, there are these kind of fixed recorded musical elements to the museum. I think building on what Whitney was talking about earlier, the kind of fixed mechanically recorded pieces of music are speaking to the contours of this broadly accepted national canonic narrative. But a lot of the live music making that's happening is not only featuring local artists, but also really self-consciously placing jazz as not separate from, but a part of the matrix of Black music making that includes both the sacred and the secular, and that is not just adjacent to, but part and parcel of Black popular culture during this period, as opposed to a kind of carve out of it as this separated or separable, serious artistic form of music. And there's a kind of tension that exists between those things that I think parallels to some extent the tension between these two institutional forces and their visions. So there's a kind of negotiation happening in the process of building this that I think you can see in the content of the exhibit itself and in what places that content lives. But I also think, and I didn't get to talk about this as much as I would have liked to, I think there's also a sense in which these things aren't at odds when you consider Kinnard's paradigm, because it's not so much about featuring local and neighborhood impact to the exclusion of talking about other things, but he wanted Black DC residents, young kids in the neighborhood, musicians and artists in Anacostia to see themselves as part of this great, broadly celebrated national and international tradition. So I think in presenting those things not just alongside each other, but kind of interweaving through each other in immersive ways, just as you could see from the vantage point of that parade, this exhibit is about understanding yourself and your community as a part of living history and living culture.
Does that satellite museum still exist? Does that facility still exist in Anacostia?
It does. It's been moved to another site about a mile, I want to say, east of central downtown Anacostia. But yeah, it's now called the Anacostia Community Museum, and it very much still exists. In fact, the quotation I read from Mr. Reynolds is from oral history interviews that they keep there from their 25th anniversary in the 90s.
There's a sense, I mean, we're going through the same kind of levels of like cultural guilt and who's defining what we should do to sort of get out of the, spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in certain ways, right or wrong, it has survived in that community. So you can look at a lot of accomplishment through that engagement, even if it was rough and tumble, in the end that it's still there.
Yeah, and just to pick up on a phrase you used that feels important to me, in this kind of act of decentering, I think sometimes even when we're game to get out of the spotlight, we certainly still want to keep control of it and control its aperture and where it's pointed and all of that. So there's a lot to do with gaze and the way that you phrase that I think is really important.
I loved your book.
Oh, thank you.
Just this morning, I've always been a member of two jazz organizations, not-for-profits. One is here and one in Poughkeepsie. And I had them both on the phone to partner up because they belong together. They both had 25 years in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're suffering through the funding mechanism. Where do we go from here? That's where we are. So if you could suggest where, is it academia? Is it private? Where do we find the money to pay artists? And just for one or two artists a year, not, so that means major artists, and hope to piggyback from that.
Yeah, I think those are great questions. Well, first I'll say thank you for, I'm really glad you loved the book, especially because it would not have been the book that it was if not for your assistance and contributions to it. Everyone, this is Mike Howard, who, one of the founding members of Jazz 966, which was the focus of the last chapter of Between Beats. He very graciously did a long interview with me, shared a lot of insight and thoughts, and took a look at that chapter. So Jazz 966 was, and hopefully will be again, a very important New York City institution, and I'm honored that you came today. To answer your question about where we go from here and specifically where do we find the money, to kind of channel my colleague Kristen Carithers in her work on music history pedagogy as labor history, in some sense the question you're asking is like the defining question of music history, because a lot of what we're talking about is how culture persists and how artists make things within shifting conditions of possibility, and especially shifting conditions economically, financially. I mean, even when I'm teaching about Mozart, we're looking at, if your patron's not going to be a single rich aristocrat or the Catholic Church, how do you hack it in 1780s Vienna? So I don't know exactly where we go from here or today. If I had a really good answer, I'd just say thank you and collect my Genius grant and be on my way. But I will say some stories I've heard, I heard recently, and this is just third hand, but I heard someone say that they were talking to scholars in South Africa where there's been a lot of divestment from the humanities, that kind of once they accepted that government support was gone and not coming back, a lot of private philanthropy stepped in to fill that role in supporting art. But it's difficult to any of that is going to come with strings and come with power of different kinds. So, I mean, there are all those kinds of sources. There's a lot of community effort and community building. I mean, one thing that I talked about in another chapter of that book, and especially in my dissertation on Chick Webb, was to take a look at how the Savoy Ballroom managed to thrive in Harlem in the early 1930s when venues like the Cotton Club had gone under. And I think in some ways, I don't know if I'm the person in the room to speak on this. I mean, you probably better than me with all of the work you've done in Brooklyn, but that there is a history of work driven by Black communities surviving during hard times, in part because those are places in which times are often hard. So community infrastructure exists persistently in place of heavy financial patronage, in place of heavy government infrastructure. So the dancer Frank Manning talked about that when the Great Depression hit, he said, I didn't notice because my family never had money anyway. So there are already kind of persistent institutions and traditions amongst people who have learned for centuries how to thrive during periods of lack and neglect. So that's one thing I think is encouraging. But also, if we think again about hip hop in the South Bronx, and to go back to what Whitney was saying, there's a lot of, I don't remember who specifically said this, but a lot of the history of musical innovation, these are not my words, is the kind of history of the creative misuse of technology. And we can think about that as something like a turntable, or think about that as, figuring out how to jack into the power that goes to a lamppost and use it to power DJ equipment. But I think we can also think about that in terms of funding bodies, bureaucracies, forms of patronage. I think that maybe this is overly optimistic with me, but I think that if we think about institutions and funders as technologies effectively, there's a lot to be learned from Black music history, particularly about persistence and about the creative misuse of technology that might inspire us in how we move forward in the present. Long way of saying I don't know, but I'm hoping for the best.
First of all, it's just great that you chose DC, because it's a place that's usually forgotten. We talk about North-South, and there's DC, this northern city, deeply segregated, so very southern in so many ways. And also that you would zero in on not the usual U Street or the Buckle of the Black Belt and in that part of town, but on Anacostia as an important neighborhood. There were bars all over town with organ trios and so on. When I grew up there, and I really think that there's and maybe you're doing this already, a big project about this moment that would include the Smithsonian's issuing of that classic jazz set.
Absolutely.
During this period, and which would include Howard University. Sterling Brown was giving a course in jazz. It wasn't an official course, but a series of lectures as early as the 40s, and there he is. And then by the early 60s, you've got Baraka and A.B. Spellman and Toni Morrison learning from him. And so but coming to my question real quickly, I wonder about the training of John Kennard. Where did he come from? There must have been a contemporary art tradition that he was drawing from, and I wonder if we couldn't map things like that elsewhere in this country or elsewhere too.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I want to talk to you more about this because it is part of a larger project. Thus far, it's been kind of moving forward from this point in the late 1960s, but you've got me thinking that I also really need to be looking backwards as well in time. I will say actually that the my impetus for doing this project is I was looking specifically at the Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz, and when it just started clicking in my mind how soon all of this infrastructure is being built in the all of this jazz infrastructure is being built in the early 70s, and who's building it, and that we're in Washington, D.C., not far from the year 1968, it just got me fascinated in who is doing this work, in what ways are they connected or not connected to the city. And in part what I'm interrogating in this project is what happens when a large, predominantly white institution claims stewardship of a black art form in a black city. And to your point, yeah, I think there's a lot of importance to Howard in this story in various times and places. For one, I'm not sure why yet, but this collaboration with the Smithsonian and the Left Bank Jazz Society ends 1970, 1971, and in and around there, they start working instead with Howard University on these concert series. So that's a question I still don't have much of an answer to, but that I'm eagerly asking. I haven't gotten to talk much at all about Julian Ewell and his coming to the Smithsonian in the mid-1960s and his overseeing the Department of Public Service, which was the umbrella for both the Anacostia Museum at its founding and for the Anacostia Museum at its founding and for the Division of Performing Arts. And him as a jazz musician himself, he both wrote in the Washington Post kind of voicing objections to Willis Conover as like the central voice of jazz in Washington, D.C. and the issues of race and representation with that. And he's also the person who recommended Martin Williams for the Smithsonian job. So quite a lot thickly going on there, and he also did some Howard collaboration on the radio. But to answer your question about John Kennard, this is another one where like I know the answer in my books, but it's not quite in my brain at the moment. But roughly he came from a background, I believe, in ministry and also from aid and development work in Africa and locally in Washington, D.C. His daughter's written a really spectacular dissertation and done research on him, among other people. So because I'm blanking a little bit on Kennard's broader biography and don't want to not do it justice, I'll just point you toward her brilliant work. And thank you so much for the question.
All right, thank you very much.